you're not bad at crochet, you just haven't learned these things yet. Welcome to Crochet 101. I want this video to basically help you understand the craft at its core level so that you're able to make anything that you want and it come out exactly how you pictured it in your head. I'm Chloe, I'm your teacher. My credentials, if you're wondering, I've been crocheting for about 15 years. I'm a full-time crochet artist. I'm completely self-taught, so I've done the field research, I've made all of the mistakes, and I want to save you guys all of the time that it took me to get to where I am right now. This is truly what I consider to be the building blocks of crochet. There's always going to be more things to learn, but if you can speak the language, then those things are going to come a lot easier. And while this video is meant to be helpful for all skill levels, especially beginners, it's not a tutorial. So if you don't already know how to make your basic stitches, you might have to come back to this later. Okay, I'm not going to spend any more time on the intro because this is rapid fire Crochet 101. So get your hooks ready and your brains ready. Let's get into it. Number 1, Basic Stitch 101. What you need to know about the characteristics of each basic stitch and what they're best used for. So starting off with slip stitch. Slip stitch is a very small, tight, and stiff stitch. It doesn't really give a lot of stretch and it doesn't add any height at all. So what this stitch is best used for is seaming things up, connecting pieces together, or moving across a row without adding any height to the row. Next, we have single crochet. Single crochet is a very small stitch and dense stitch, and it takes a very long time to make much progress with it. That's not necessarily a bad thing. There's definitely a time and place to use single crochet, but if you want something flowy and drapey and airy, do not use single crochet. One of the first projects I ever made as a crocheter was a queen size blanket entirely made out of single crochet, and I'm surprised I stuck with the craft after that. Don't do that. So single crochet creates a very opaque fabric. You don't need to use single crochet in order to get an opaque fabric. However, if you want something very stiff and very dense, this might be the stitch for you. So what single crochet is best used for are things like amigurumi, or things you want a very solid fabric for, like maybe a dishcloth, sturdy tote bag, basically things you want the least amount of stretch over time. Next, we'll talk about double crochet, which in my opinion is the most versatile stitch. It works up really quickly and it still maintains a little bit of opacity. You do start to get a little bit of the gaps between stitches with this one, but not too badly. I consider this one the most versatile because it's used, I think, in the most stitch combinations, like stitch patterns. Things like granny stitch, granny squares, shell stitch, puff stitch, all of these things are rooted with double crochet as the building block. It's also a really good balance between structure and drapiness. So you can make a lot of good clothing fabric with this because it does allow for a little bit of drape and flow while still, like I said, maintaining some opacity so it's not a see-through garment entirely. Double crochet is great for a wide range of projects, including, but definitely not limited to, blankets, anything granny square, which is a limitless category in and of itself. Lots of clothing and tons of other stuff out there. Next is half double crochet. Half double crochet is a middle ground between single crochet and double crochet. It has a lot more structure and opacity than double crochet, but it's not nearly as stiff and small as single crochet. As someone who specializes in clothing, I absolutely love half double crochet. I think it creates such a aesthetically pleasing and cute texture for clothing, and it's the perfect stitch to get a completely opaque fabric without it being hard and stiff. So in my opinion, what half double crochet is best for is clothing, but clothing that you want a slightly more dense fabric for. Things like sweaters, hats, bathing suits, and bottoms that you want to be opaque, but maybe not like the flowy, tiny, lightweight tops that you're thinking of. Those you might want to use triple crochet for. Triple crochet works up very quickly and it has a very nice, airy, lacy kind of feel to it. However, it's not very opaque. So if you're making clothing that you want to not be see-through, this might not be the best one. What I think triple crochet is best for is lacy projects that you want to be really lightweight and flowy, but maybe not the most high coverage. Number 2, yarn 101. Just because a yarn looks pretty does not mean it's going to behave the way you want it to for a specific project. So this is going to be how to pick a yarn weight and how to pick a yarn fiber. The 3 main categories of yarn are man-made, plant-based, and animal-based. In the man-made category, the most common you're going to see is acrylic. Acrylic yarn is extremely affordable and very accessible, which makes it a really great option for beginners. For clothing, I don't typically recommend acrylic. It's not not very breathable and it can sometimes be a little bit scratchy, and because it's a synthetic fiber, I personally just don't really like having it on my skin. However, if you are going to use it for clothing, things you're going to wear in colder weather, because it's not breathable, you don't want to make warm weather items in acrylic yarn. In the plant-based category, the most common is going to be cotton. Cotton is my personal all-time favorite yarn. I use it for almost everything. I think it's the most breathable. I think it's the most comfortable, and especially things you're going to be wearing when it's hot outside. It's just going to be your best friend if you're making summer clothing. Animal-based yarn, the most common is probably wool. These yarns as a whole are going to be best for winter projects. Big sweaters, blankets, things you want to be comfy and cozy and stay warm in. Animal-based yarns insulate very well, so it's going to keep you really warm. The size of your yarn or the weight of your yarn matters, because it's also going to help determine things like drape, opacity, weight, and bulkiness. It took me a while to understand the different weights of the yarns because they're also called a lot of different things, but here's my brief rundown of each size, what it's also called, and what I would use it for. First, we'll talk about size 1 yarn, which is also called sock yarn or fingering yarn. This is going to be your smallest yarn apart from like crochet thread. So what it's really good for is extremely lightweight projects that are very, very drapey. Projects that are on the more lacy side, that doesn't mean it has to be a lace stitch, but just keep in mind it's going to feel almost like lace because it's so lightweight. So you can use this to make really delicate projects like a very dainty little cardigan. But for example, you wouldn't want to use this for something heavy duty like a bag or a sweater that's meant for warmth, or something that's meant to carry any weight or withstand a lot of roughness. Next, we'll talk about size 2 yarn, which is also called baby yarn or sport weight yarn. One step up from lace, so it's a little bit more durable and a little bit more thick, but it's still going to give a lot of drape and create a lightweight fabric as well. I like to use sport weight yarn when I'm making clothes that I want to be really drapey because size 1 is just a little bit too small for me. It's very tedious and it takes a lot of time. If you're an absolute beginner, I would maybe recommend skipping size 1 and 2 for now and come back to them later, just because they're so small, they can be hard to see your details. As a beginner, it's really helpful to be able to see all of the detail of your stitches in more of a magnified sense. So if you do make a mistake, it's easier to find it. Size 3 yarn, which is also called DK or light worsted, is an extremely versatile yarn, I think, for clothing. It has a decent thickness to it, to the point where things work up quickly so you don't lose your mind, but it still is light enough that it's not really stiff. I personally tend to use DK weight yarn the most for all of my clothing, so this is good for things like skirts, pants, shorts, tops. I made this particular top in DK weight yarn. Just keep in mind it is starting to get a little bit bigger, so you're gonna lose just a little bit of detailing. So if you want to keep your details really small and really dainty, go 1 and 2. But if you want to work up a little bit more quick and still appreciate the drape that it gives, go 3. Next we have weight 4 yarn, which is also called worsted weight yarn or worsted weight yarn. I think weight 4 yarn is the best yarn for beginners to work with. I think it's the perfect size to still be able to see your stitches really clearly, but still create a piece that's not too bulky. Worsted weight I also think is the most available at craft stores. I feel like when you walk through the aisles of craft stores, you're mostly seeing worsted weight acrylic yarn. It's really accessible. There's a lot of really cheap options. Now, personally, I've began to stray away from worsted weight because it's just a little bit too big for my liking when it comes to clothing. But keep in mind, I made all of my crochet clothing with worsted weight for the first 12 years of my crochet career. I just now tend to like a little bit more drape than what it can provide. Unless, of course, you're making things that you want to be a little bit more bulky, like sweaters and hats and things that are more for warmer weather. Or if you're not making clothes at all, it's great for blankets, it's great for decor, and it can be great for bags as well. Size 5 yarn, which is also called chunky yarn, you're starting to get on the bigger and bulkier side. So I would recommend using this for things like big sweaters or blankets that you want to be chunky. But keep in mind, it's going to start getting chunky when you start getting this big. And you almost start to lose the stitch definition and you can't quite see the anatomy of the stitch quite as well. So like I said, if you're an absolute beginner, I do recommend staying in weight 4 or worsted weight yarn. The last size that I'm going to talk about is size 6, which is also called super chunky yarn. There's not a ton more left to say other than just it's a little bit bigger than size 5. You're getting really chunky and really bulky. This can be fun for things like the cloud cardigan, my pattern that uses this. But basically, we've said what we need to say about yarn. you get it. Number 3, hook size 101. What hook size should you be using for what situations? There are so many different crochet hook sizes ranging from, I don't know, 0.25 millimeter up to 25 millimeter, probably even more than that. So it can be very overwhelming to see that as a beginner and just not have any idea what any of it means or why they make a difference. Here's what you need to keep in mind when picking a hook size. First of all, what yarn are you using? You want to pair your hook size to your yarn. On almost every single ball of yarn that you can buy, on the back of the label, it's going to tell you what hook size pairs best with it. That doesn't necessarily always mean that it's going to be the best with it, though. I a lot of times use a different hook than what it says, but it is a good starting point. If you have absolutely no idea, you'll be okay with the hook that it recommends. But basically, hook size paired with your tension determines the size of your individual stitches, which in turn will determine the size of your rows and your project overall. Now, if you use a smaller yarn with a really big hook, you're going to get a very lacy and airy type of fabric because there's so much space in between the yarn in each stitch, if that makes sense. But if you use that same size yarn with a much smaller hook, you're going to get a more solid and sturdy stitch. So choosing your hook size basically determines not only the opacity of the fabric, but the stitch definition. So how well you can see each stitch and how much structure they have. Number 4, what should you make to practice as a beginner? Well, first off, I'm going to start by saying my recommendation for a beginner starting out is using, like I said, a worsted weight or size 4 yarn and a hook size between 5 millimeters and 6 millimeters. Those are pretty much the only things I used for the first few years of me crocheting, and I feel like it was just the perfect mix. Other people might say differently, I don't know, but here are some projects that you could actually work on. So I think first and foremost, the most obvious and the most beginner would be something like a scarf, because you can really just make a straight line to practice your stitches, practice your consistency of your tension, and at the end of it, you have a scarf. You can also jazz that scarf up by using different stitch combinations. But the beauty of a scarf is that it's literally just one long rectangle, no increases, no decreases, no sizing, no shaping. It's just a great way to practice. Okay, if you're bored of scarves, I'd also say hats are great to practice with. There's a lot of different ways you can make hats. You can make beanies, you can make bucket hats, you can make sun hats, but this is a great way to start practicing crocheting in the round. If you haven't done that yet, it's basically instead of going row to row, it's when you're working in a circle and then you go up and you work the next circle around. Okay, if you want to start having even a little bit more fun than that, granny squares. Trust me on this. If you learn how to make a granny square, which is very simple, your possibilities are endless. You can make all kinds of clothes, things like pants, cardigans, sweaters, tops, skirts, anything that you can think of, you can make with the granny square. You can also make bags, you can make blankets, you can make pillows. Basically, if you can make a granny square, you can make anything. Seriously, I can't stress this enough. Make granny squares if you're a beginner, because you're just making the same thing over and over again. And then just depending on how you connect them, you can create unlimited things. And also, I think another great project to practice on as a beginner, bags. Bags can be a lot easier for beginners than certain items of clothing because you don't have to worry about sizing and measurements. All you really have to do is make 2 rectangles, sew them together, and add a strap. Boom, you have a simple bag. Number 5 is starting and ending rows. A huge problem area that I see for beginners that causes a lot of confusion and a lot of frustration is the start and the end of every row, because this is the area that you're most likely to accidentally drop a stitch or add a stitch, making your edges not straight. So basically, when you start a new row, you're going to chain a certain amount of chains as a turning chain. Now, there's some debate in the community whether turning chains count as a stitch or not. I personally, 90% of the time, don't like to count turning chains as stitches because I think that creates a really wonky and wobbly edge. That's my personal preference. But you can have your own preference. The most important thing is that you stay consistent with it. You always have to do the exact same thing on every row, or else you're going to accidentally add and drop stitches. Now, if you're having trouble in this area, the best possible thing you could do for yourself is use stitch markers. You don't even have to buy stitch markers. You can use things like bobby pins, paper clips, safety pins, basically anything that you can stick through a stitch. Now, how you would want to use your stitch markers to help with this area is put your stitch marker in the very first stitch of your row and then the very last stitch of your row. That way, when you start your new row, you know exactly which stitch to go into to begin with, and you know where the last place is to put your last stitch. Doing this every single row will make sure you don't accidentally increase or decrease each time. This is really common, and it is genuinely confusing, so don't feel bad about it. Even as a seasoned professional, I sometimes second guess myself which is my first and last stitch. So there's absolutely no shame in marking your stitches. Trust me, it's a game changer. You'll thank me when your edges are straight. Number 6, how to end your work when you're done. For some reason, for a while, this was confusing for me. I couldn't figure out how to properly fasten off, weave in my ends, make sure it didn't unravel. I don't know why I was so confused. Maybe you're not. Maybe it was just me. But this was a problem area for me that I wish someone would have talked about more. So to end your work, it's so simple. Just chain 1, cut your yarn, pull your yarn through, and tighten that knot. Now your yarn is tied off, but you don't want to cut this tail off at the knot. Don't do that. Your work will unravel. What you want to do instead, take this long tail of yarn that you have left over, you put it through a darning needle and you weave it through your stitches as best as you can. Basically just hide the end, because if you cut the end at the knot, then the knot's going to come undone, and then so is your work. And just to let you know, weaving in ends is the absolute worst part of crochet. We all hate it. You just have to. Next, I'm going to talk about how to make your crochet clothing items actually fit. Now, I know it's possible that not everybody watching this video is interested in making clothing, but clothing is my specialty, and it took a long time to get things right because I didn't understand how to make things fit, how to take measurements, how to make stretchy fabric versus stiff fabric. So in case you are interested in this, I'm going to give some rapid fire tips, but I can go more in depth on this in another video because there's just so much to say about that. But here are some off the top of my head helpful tips. The most important one, which I've already talked about a little bit throughout this video, is understanding drape. Drape is so important because not all fabrics that you make are going to work for all situations. For example, a really solid and tight fabric is going to be great for something like a super dense tote bag that you want to be weight bearing, but it's going to make for a really bulky and stiff and uncomfortable garment because it's not going to lay on your body the way that you're used to for clothing. So it's important to really think in your head when you're making clothing, what do I want the drape of this particular garment to be? And then use the tips that I've already provided accordingly. If you want it to be a really airy, soft, drapey piece of clothing, you might want to use a smaller yarn and maybe double crochet or triple crochet. If you want it to be something really solid and high coverage, like maybe a bikini top, you're going to want to use maybe more like a DK yarn and a 3mm hook and a half double crochet or a single crochet. Next is understanding how to take measurements of yourself. Now this is really important because it will result in the size of your garment, obviously, and how it fits you. This is something that you're always going to be learning though. Like I still end up making things too big or too small for myself on accident because I just made a mistake. It happens. But there's a relatively simple breakdown for each garment and what measurements you would use to make that garment. For example, a top or a sweater, you're going to be using your shoulder to shoulder measurement. You see here how mine goes from my shoulder to my other shoulder. The smaller you make this, the tighter your top is going to be. The bigger you make this, the more oversized and kind of flowy it's going to be. Now, if you're making something that you want to be a little bit more form-fitted, fit tighter on your waist, there are a few ways you can do that. You can always do a corset back, which is the most common and probably the simplest way. You just, instead of making a top that wraps all the way around you, you just make one panel that doesn't completely connect in your back, and then you lace it up and tie it. However, if you want a closed back, you can also still kind of implement the corset concept into a closed back design. You just make your top, and then you put a tie in the back from one side of your waist to the other side of your waist, and you cinch it tight. You might get a little bit of wrinkles in the back, but it's probably going to be fine. This same concept goes for things like waistbands. You can always add a drawstring to cinch things up, but if you want to elevate it a little bit, you can utilize things like ribbing and elastic. So there are certain stitches that create more of a ribbing effect, which will give you a stretchier fabric so that you can pull it over your hips, but then it kind of resumes its shape when it gets over your hips and onto your waist. The only thing is with crochet, over time, this will probably stretch out. So eventually you might just have to end up adding a drawstring, but it does give it more shaping and a little bit more of a classic look, like you're used to seeing a waistband on pants or on shorts. So to make ribbing, it's really simple. You basically just take a stitch you already know, a slip stitch, a single crochet, or a half double crochet, and instead of working into both of the loops, you work into the back loop only. There's tons of tutorials for this online if you haven't used this stitch before. Just look up half double crochet back loop only and there'll be a tutorial for it. But this is how you make ribbing, which creates a more elasticy and stretchy stitch. Speaking of elastic, you can always add elastic. For a while, this was so frustrating to me because I was like, why can't I just make things fit the way other clothes fit? It's because so many clothes use elastic, and I was trying so hard not to use elastic. Half of the clothes in my closet wouldn't fit the way they do if they didn't use elastic. You can always add elastic into your crochet. It's a game changer. And last but not least, when it comes to clothing, is don't forget to block it. Blocking is really important and really underrated, and something I didn't even know about for the first, 5 years of crocheting. Blocking, really quickly for those who don't know, is essentially when you get your project wet, whether it be steaming or soaking or whatever, and then you stretch it and you shape it. This makes a really big difference because when you first finish your project, your stitches are still really tightly wound up. Like there's still a lot of tension in the yarn. And when you do this, it relaxes the fibers of the yarn and therefore relaxes the entire garment. So when you first finish a project and it's kind of like weirdly poking out in certain areas and not laying the way you thought it was gonna lay, try blocking it. It'll probably make it fit much more relaxed, like you were expecting it to. Okay, finally, the last tip that I want to tell you guys is more of a mental thing. I need you to understand that when you make a mistake in crochet, it does not mean that you're bad at crochet. If you had any idea how many mistakes that I still make, this is my full-time job. I create pieces that people really like, but behind the scenes, the amount of mistakes that went into those pieces, the amount of times I have to frog an entire piece over and over and over before I get the design right. Just basically what I'm saying is keep in mind, everybody, no matter what skill level, makes constant mistakes. It's part of the game. You cannot get better without making the mistakes. You cannot learn lessons without making the mistakes. It is absolutely part of the craft forever. I know that's kind of scary to hear and think about it, but you just need to remind yourself to have fun with the mistakes. Easier said than done. Trust me, I don't always do this. Sometimes I want to scream and light my project on fire and quit the craft altogether. Hello, we have a visitor. Do you have any other tips that I might have missed? Very insightful, thank you. Just don't let it shake your confidence when you make a mistake. I make more mistakes than I make successes. Trust me, I'm not exaggerating. More often than not, the first time you make a piece, it's a trial run. You'll probably have to make it again if you want it to be perfect. It's just going to happen. You're constantly learning and you're constantly upgrading your skill set, and it feels so good to fix the mistake that you made the first go around and know that you just taught yourself that. All I'm saying is have fun and have patience. Okay, I hope that those tips helped you or answered any questions you might have had. Obviously, there's still so much more ground to cover when it comes to crocheting. This was more just like the building blocks. We're not going to cover every single detail in 101. So leave a comment with any other crochet question you have. There's no such thing as a dumb question, and I will make a collection of them, and I'll make another video in the future if you guys want. If this video helped you in any way, or you just enjoyed it in any way, or you have any interest in making me happy, give it a like, give it a comment, give it a subscribe. Just hit all the buttons. All of the nice ones. Don't forget to follow me on Instagram, where I post all of my designs and all of my crochet announcements. If this was just useless information entirely to you, sorry. Thanks for watching. Bye.